more than 24 people were killed in multiple suicide bombings in Afghanistan.
Yeah, after the first attack, journalists and first responders rushed to the scene, and then a second bomber dressed as a journalist detonated a device, increasing the carnage. Correspondent Julia McFarlane has the latest.
A double suicide attack during morning rush hour in the heart of Kabul. At least 25 are reported dead and more than 40 injured. ISIS in Afghanistan claiming responsibility for the deadly blasts. The first attack was carried out by a suicide bomber on a motorcycle in an area which is home to NATO headquarters in Kabul and not far from the US embassy. A second blast followed just as dozens of journalists rushed to the scene. The second bomber, pretending to be one of them, exploding his device in the crowd. One of the journalists killed was the AFP news agency's chief Afghanistan photographer Shah Marai, a father of 6, the youngest of his children just 15 days old. Their global news director calling his loss a devastating blow. Monday's attack comes just 2 days after a Taliban suicide bombing in southern Helmand and just over a week after another ISIS attack killed more than 50 people at a voter registration center in the capital.
That was Julia McFarlane reporting. A third suicide bomb killed 11 children and 8 Romanian NATO troops wounded in Kandahar. Civilians in Afghanistan are at the mercy of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban, who last week announced their annual spring offensive. It's a season of violence and instability.
In the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there has been more deadly violence near the Gaza border.
At least 2 Palestinians were killed. Israel says they attacked soldiers with explosives and that the soldiers responded. A third Palestinian was also killed in a separate incident for trying to cross the border from Gaza.
For a month, the border has been the site of deadly clashes. Israelis accuse the militant group Hamas of instigating mass protests and using women and children as human shields. So far, at least 39 Palestinians have been killed.
And Israel's use of force during those demonstrations is now being challenged in court.
Yeah, a group of non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, are suing the Israeli army. They are accusing the Israeli forces of shooting at unarmed protesters and say those rules of engagement are illegal. Correspondent and anchor Elan Levy reports.
Stop shooting at unarmed protesters. That's what a coalition of human rights groups told the Israeli army, taking it to the High Court to challenge its rules of engagement on the Israel-Gaza border.
We're saying not to shoot at unarmed civilians who don't pose any threat to life. There's a set of tools that are non-lethal that the state uses against demonstrations, and that's what they're expected to do.
Dozens of Palestinians have been killed in violent protests on the Israel-Gaza border in the last month. They're demanding a right for refugees of the 1948 war and their descendants to return to Israel. They've thrown stones, attacked the fence, and tried to storm the border. 6 Israeli NGOs told the High Court that the army's rules of engagement are illegal. They say soldiers must not shoot at Palestinians who pose no imminent threat to human life.
There is no ground in international law to allow such use of force. Journalists have been killed. Children have been killed. Women have been injured. So are these all combatants? Is this a war?
The IDF said the NGO's claims were absurd and they'd been duped by Hamas propaganda. It said the riots were part of the armed conflict between the terror organization Hamas and Israel may shoot the main inciters.
These violent riots were organized, coordinated and directed by Hamas, a terror organization involved in armed conflict with Israel. Hamas sought to gain military benefit from breaching the security barrier in a way that would enable a mass infiltration of terrorists into Israel.
The IDF did not allow its army lawyers to be interviewed, saying we're not doing press, but the state's lawyers were backed up by the Israeli Terror Victims Association.
If you're talking about someone who is saying, get up everyone, run towards the fence, the law says that you can use force that are against people who are posing an immediate concrete threat to life, but they don't have to be necessarily the person who is standing there with the gun in front of you.
The court has not granted the NGO's request for an interim order banning the use of sniper fire and hasn't reached a verdict on whether the rules of engagement are legal. It will reconvene in May after both sides submit more information. Protests are said to continue every Friday, culminating in massive riots on the 15th of May. Human rights groups claim more innocent lives will be lost. Israel says if hundreds of terrorists break into the country, the cost in blood will be even greater still. Elan Levy, I-24 News.
Meantime, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has expressed his support for Israel's response to the protests on the Israeli-Gaza border.
Pompeo just spoke from Amman, Jordan, during his first foreign trip since being confirmed in the role.
About the activities in Gaza over the past days and weeks, we do believe the Israelis have the right to defend themselves, and we're fully supportive of that.
Pompeo's comments come just a day after meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Pompeo urged the Palestinians to return to the negotiating table and resume talks with Israel to try and end the long-running Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
To discuss, let's bring in Jacob Kornblue, national political reporter for Jewish Insider. Jacob, great to have you here. We just heard Secretary of State Mike Pompeo really backing Israel when it comes to the protests on the Gaza border. But we know that the administration really has Israel's back in almost every aspect. An alleged strike in Syria, even pointing out to lies from Iran.
But you've also seen a shift in the rhetoric from the current Secretary of State to the previous, which is returning to the head table, and Pompeo saying that a two-state solution is an option for this administration. This is the first time that the administration is indicating that they might pursue a two-state solution. It might not be called a two-state solution. It might have a different name. You see David Friedman trying to change terms when it comes to occupation, when it comes to the West Bank, trying to call it Judea and Samaria and so on. But you clearly see that the administration's focus is to return to diplomacy, and even though after opening the Jerusalem embassy, we might see Trump roll out his peace plan.
But how is that peace plan, or how has diplomacy helped when you have 39 Palestinians killed along the Gaza border, in which and situation where, look, they're not being peaceful. I think we can agree on that. But isn't there a way for Israel to not use lethal force and still try to contain the protests?
I think Israel has managed to contain the protests, even though it might have gotten out of hand here and there. After all, it's Gaza. It's not the West Bank. Hamas still controls Gaza, and Abbas still is trying to return to control Gaza. The administration has put more focus on security in Gaza than in the West Bank or pursuing a two-state solution. So it remains to be seen if the administration will try to put the two together. West Bank and Gaza return to normalcy, return to security on the border, and then we'll roll out our peace plan where we will try to bring the two sides together, at least to the negotiation table.
And briefly looking forward, how do you see the Israeli-Palestinian conflict down the stretch?
I think again, it all depends in what comes out from this peace plan. The administration and the Israeli government is not looking for escalation, especially in light of today's events. The border with Lebanon and Syria is much more important to contain than the Gaza border, but it's pretty clear that Netanyahu is not ready to say no to a Trump peace plan. He'll say yes, but the question is, will Abbas say yes, but, or has he already managed to cross the Rubicon and say, it's not for me?
And another question is, who does Abbas represent at this point?
Other issue.
Jacob Kornblue, thank you.
Thank you.
And coming up on Crossroads, North Korea is offering to shut down its nuclear test site if the United States promises not to attack.
Meantime, in another sign that a peace deal may be in the works, South Korea says it is planning to stop blasting propaganda at the North over the border.